Uh, I will have a kind of a free talk or free discussion. I don't want to be bounded to specific text. If you want to read more, I can suggest a few texts that I've written on the subject. But I would like to start with the argument that the subject of this discussion today has to do also with the fact that more and more liberal democracies, we talked about it yesterday, are resorting to state of emergency. And that the argument is that there is a war against terrorism, and liberal democracies have to defend themselves against terrorism, and all this kind of arguments that you would find all over the universe. And one specific kind of interesting information is that more and more money are being diverted from NATO into the Interpol. And the idea that the enemy is now within the metropolitan cities of Europe or the North America, it seems like that the natives write back, so to speak. Or as Carl Schmitt once said, Europe has become the colony of all colonies. And Alain Benoit, the right-winger, French right-winger, have used this several times. And there is an increasingly use of the exception to the law in liberal democracies. And I don't want to go now into the internal grammar of state of exception, but I would make a distinction, which I will go back into at the end, between a temporal exception, where you have an exception with an expiration date. That is, there's an Ebola epidemic and we have to stay in this room for 21 days, but after 21 days we'll be released. Under this condition, the law is being suspended under the auspices of the law. And places where you don't have only a temporal exception, but you have a spatial, as in space, exception. Places, territories where the exception is being used constantly without an expiration date. The place I come from in Israel, there is a state of exception without an expiration date at all. How is this discussion related to Hannah Arendt? Well, I would like to start with the first question that I already posed, is what kind of bureaucracy has Hannah Arendt in mind when she came to Jerusalem in 1961? She labeled Eichmann as a bureaucratic criminal. But what do we mean by bureaucracy? Hannah Arendt comes to as a reporter to the New Yorker in 1961. She comes from New York. She's been 14 years in America without citizenship. This is a very important issue for the discussion later on. And she writes 5 pieces to the New Yorker, which later on being assembled into her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Now, we have to pay attention to the fact that the title, The Banality of Evil, never exists in the book, only in the epilogue. And the title has been suggested to her by Karl Jaspers at the very last minute. So in many senses, it's not an integral part of the book. And this is a very important point of departure for our discussion. Hannah Arendt comes to Jerusalem. She was a Zionist at one point. She changes her Zionist allegiance at another point because she's disappointed with Zionism, and she is disappointed with the relationship between Zionism, or the relationship of Zionism to the Arab problem or the Palestinian problem. She supports binationalism and not a sovereign state which monopolizes a territory, population, and language, as the situation today in Palestine, Israel is. And she popularized the notion of obedience to authority. By the way, she made a very, very important distinction between power and authority. This is something else which will, if you want, we can go to that later on. The Eichmann trial has an important ramification, at least for two domains. For the domain of law, we have to remember that after 1945 we have the Nuremberg trials. And under the Nuremberg trials, a new legal category emerged in the global sense, which is crimes against humanity. And in the Eichmann trial, she observes us, there is a reverse, there is a regression, there is a particularistic approach where the category, the legal category that the Israeli general attorney is using is a crimes against the Jewish people. And she thinks that this is somehow peculiar. And she writes about it. What happens to crimes against humanity? Why do they have to be changed and relabeled and used as crimes against the Jewish people only? Now, Israel kidnapped Eichmann from Buenos Aires, as Carlos well knows. You have been there already? Yeah. And later on, she was accused by the global community for violating sovereignty rights or whatever. The Eichmann attorney argues that Israel never existed when these crimes were perpetrated, and the answer of the general attorney was the Jewish people always existed, as if it's in romantic Germany, and all kind of arguments about the legality of this trial, which was in a sense a political trial. Israel renowned poet Nathan Alterman called it a pedagogic poem. That is, we, as Ben-Gurion, the prime minister at the time, said, we have to educate the youngster, and particularly the Mizrahim and the Arabs, what the Jewish people have gone through. And so this is the domain of legality. There are also historical or historiographical implications, because the Nuremberg trials gave rise to historiographical tradition, which would call universal tradition. In this tradition, we would find Raoul Hilberg, for example, The Destruction of European Jews, a very neglected book that was never translated to Hebrew because of the conflict between Raoul Hilberg, who tells us a general story, and the keepers of the Holocaust memorial within Israel and the museum and all this kind of thing, that rejected his argument because you can't be a generalist. You have to understand that anti-Semitism was the reason behind the Holocaust and not some banality of evil or bureaucracy kind of argument. And Raoul Hilberg, by the way, I met with him before he died. He was haunted by that. He thought that he would finish. This is if I start talking about Raoul Hilberg, I will never finish. Raoul Hilberg went to Columbia. He was a student of Franz Neumann. He wrote a book called The Politics of Memory, where he vilifies Hannah Arendt, who sent a letter review to Princeton. She herself wrote in this review that Raoul Hilberg's book is pretty stupid. And he would ask me, do I look stupid to you? I mean, he was haunted by that. And Hannah Arendt used his books and information and statistics during the trial, while she was rejecting his book for Princeton and things like this. She wasn't a nice woman, by the way. But Raoul Hilberg writes about the general historical lesson, the universal lesson of the Holocaust. If you want another example, is Christopher Browning, Ordinary Man, where he shows that people volunteered to join the SS, nobody forces them, etc., etc., etc. And I'm sorry, sorry, I got it wrong. Browning said, this is Goldhagen what I said, Browning said that the people that joined the SS were ordinary people. There's nothing about them. They didn't hate particularly Jews. Hitler himself said that the Kristallnacht was a barbaric event, right? We don't kill people in an unorderly way. And so this is the general universal historiography following Nuremberg. But following the Eichmann trial, we would find the particularistic version of historiographical analysis where anti-Semitism was at the center of analysis. And if you would take Daniel Goldhagen, Hitler's willing executioner, he would say that those people volunteered rather than being coerced to join the forces. Hannah Arendt voiced the first option, the generalist, the universal option to the Holocaust. By that time, when she arrived to Jerusalem, she already wrote the origin of the totalitarianism and also the human condition in 1958. And she had 3 different theses in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem. One is her concern about the possible Zionization of the Holocaust, which was really prophetic, because what Netanyahu is doing all over the world is the Zionization and instrumentalization of the Holocaust, and this is exactly what she was fearful of. The second was the argument about the Judenrat, which is about the intermediary Jewish people who helped the Nazis in the camp, in the ghettos, etc. When the rabbi of Vienna gives Eichmann a list of 130,000 people, their addresses, the keys, she says this intermediacy helps the genocide process. And the last argument was, of course, about the banality of evil. Now, as I said earlier, this title was given to her by Karel Jaspers, who was her advisor. And when she made this argument, she was really became a persona non grata in the Jewish world, particularly in America where she lived. People vilified her, called her Heidegger's bimbo, all kind of sexism, because she had some romance with Heidegger prior to the war, and things like this. When Arendt came to Jerusalem, she criticized the general attorney, Gideon Hausner. She says very bad things about him. She says that he's a Galician Jew, that probably doesn't know languages, that his argument that the guy who sits in front of us is an animal, is a satanic person, a person who is beyond and outside the human range. Hannah Arendt says that this is stupid, because evil is not being done by the Satan or by whatever, it's done by ordinary people, sometimes good people, who do evil. And we have to understand the secularization and the sociologization of evil, that is not a theological concept, is not an Augustinus kind of relationship between God and man. This is an issue that takes place between ordinary people. When she came to Jerusalem, she has a very interesting observation about what she sees. And this is very typical of Hannah Arendt. She says, luckily, the 3 judges are of German origin. The 3 judges in court were German Jews, the best of German Jewry. So she still values the German culture, whatever, even there in 1961. And she says, and there is this general attorney, Gideon Hausner. He seems to me stupid, unintelligent, a person who is not in command of any language, who makes constant mistakes, and his whole argument, his whole thesis is wrong. And then she has an observation about the police corps, the Israeli police corps, that look to her Arab, but they speak Hebrew. Of course, these are the Arab Jews. And it's interesting because the police that guard Eichmann throughout the trial were only Arab Jews, because they were looking for people who did not have an experience in the Holocaust, not to harm him. So they all were Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries, who, this is an interesting ethnic phenomenon itself. I've written about that, but I won't go into that now. And then she says, outside the court door, the Oriental mob, as if you are in Istanbul, Cairo, or Baghdad, something like this. So this is Oriental outlook about the Israeli society in general. And the term banality of evil refers there into a superficial mind of a bureaucrat who is thoughtless, a bureaucrat that was not motivated by sheer hatred. He was doing his job, and his job was the immigration of Jews. And Eichmann himself was labeled later on by interpreters as somebody who was really, really surprised to find out that he was accused for doing his job in the German bureaucracy, in the Nazi bureaucracy. And Gidenhauser is trying to show that this guy is actually the devil, flesh and blood. But Eichmann was tested 9 times in prison and got out normal in all tests. And Hannah Arendt's argument in the banality of evil is considered the first time when evil is secularized, when evil is normalized, when evil is rationalized, not in the normative sense, in the sociological sense. Now, the view that Eichmann was an instant of an ardent bureaucrat goes hand in hand with Raoul Hilberg's idea of desk murderers, people who were sitting behind desks with a piece of paper and a pen, and they were as murderers as other people who shoot and did other horrible things to Jews and other people. And she has some comments about a person being a cog in the, or a functionary in the administrative machine. It's not that she completely ignored this kind of arguments, but in that sense, she's completely Weberian. I'm talking about Max Weber, understanding of bureaucracy. When one looks at the interpretation of Eichmann on Jerusalem, there are 3 main interpretations. One takes us to European phenomenology, to Husserl, Heidegger, and those kind of phenomenological consciousness of where and how different people feel in different situations and contexts. Another one was the concept of the political, of course. Hannah Arendt wrote later on, the human condition, and in the human condition she has the concept of the political as an autonomous concept. And the third one, of course, is German sociology and instrumental rationality. Now, the instrumental rationality argument is rooted in Max Weber, Zweck Rationalität, and referring to instrumental action that becomes a value in itself. And Weber has, it's not a time to talk about Weber in general, but Weber has this argument about the rationalization of the world, or the disenchantment of the world with modernity, with the Protestant ethic, the rationalization of the West, and the rise of modern bureaucracy. In the Weberian terminology, Weber, who is a neo-Kantian, has this duality in his epistemological model, where he can entertain simultaneously the idea of social action and unintended consequences of social action, between charisma and the routinization of the charisma, between value rationality and morality and instrumental rationality. Now, Weber, Weber was also a legal scholar. He was doing social history, and he had an idea that the model for the social sciences, the ideal type for the social sciences, is a combination of nomothetic and ideographic point of view, which ostensibly are antagonistic to each other, but they can coexist to understand human action. And Weber saw the towering effect of rational legal bureaucracy and its horrifying consequences at times. So Weber was there to understand that bureaucracy is a rational action, but sometimes something happens to bureaucracy, and bureaucracy goes awry, and things go wrong, and this kind of idea emerged after the Second World War, for example, within the Frankfurt School. For example, Horkheimer and Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment, is exactly that kind of argument. This is, they talk about a Weberian argument of rationality which go berserk, which loses its integrity and replaces, for example, means with ends and things like this. For example, if you read Franz Neumann, Behemoth, which is an amazing book that was written during the war in 1942, he shows how the German system was based on 4 pillars. Each of them were completely rational, but the relationship between the four pillars were absent. So you can being acquitted from the court and being arrested by the SS, but each system, each pillar worked very rationally. Or the Eclipse of Reason of Theodor Adorno and books like that at the time. This interpretation re-emerged in the wake of Hannah Arendt's book in Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. The first to pick up on that was Stanley Milgram and his social psychological experiments with obedience, where he shows how regular people, students at Stanford would not hesitate to obey to authority and do wrong things or wrongdoing to other people. And of course, for example, Milgram experiments were conducted in 1961, immediately after Hannah Arendt published her articles, and bingo, he writes, "This is perhaps the most fundamental lesson of our study. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process." This is Milgram. Browning, as I mentioned him earlier, he said that the final solution is an exercise, a textbook exercise of a bureaucratic society. Or Weizenbaum, Kellman and Feingold, people that went on this interpretation of Arendt and developed and interpreted her position as if she was saying that the final solution was a textbook exercise in instrumental reasoning. It was Bauman, Zygmunt Bauman, who focused more on the nature of bureaucratic instrumental rationality and argued that, I'm quoting, "The light shed by the Holocaust on our knowledge of bureaucratic rationality is at its most dazzling once we realize the extent to which the very idea of the final solution was an outcome of a bureaucratic culture." Why is it so? Bauman gives us a long analysis of what bureaucratic reasoning is. And basically, he has two main principles that he emphasizes. One is that the Nazi machine was expressing an extreme form of rationality as defined by efficiency, carefully calculated design of means and ends, predictability and the elimination of chance. And the second one was dissociation of means and ends, or the tendency of all bureaucracies to lose sight of its original goal and to concentrate on the means instead, and the means which turn into the ends. And this dissociation has to do with the strong culture of bureaucratic rationality. Now, all these interpretations do accept the idea, the Weberian idea, that modern society went through processes of rationalization. And rationalization, according to Weber, is not a psychological concept that we rationalize what after the fact, something that happened before, but he talks about the rationalization of the modern system, the political system, the legal system, the market, the economic system, etc., 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 along with the disenchantment of the world. They all believed that what was paramount here is the rule of law. Now, I believe that Hannah Arendt saw things differently. And I think that she was in herself a victim of that kind of interpretation. In order to answer the question, what did Hannah Arendt have in mind? Or what kind of bureaucracy, or what kind of a bureaucratic model she had in mind when she came to Jerusalem? As I said earlier, we need to read simultaneously Les Origines de Totalitarism, that was written in 1950, or published in 1950, and she actually wanted the book to be called The Three Pillars of Hell: Totalitarianism, Anti-Semitism, and Imperialism. But the editor said, this kind of title will not sell anything. You should call it The Origin of Totalitarianism. And she was furious with this kind of title. I'm not an historian, she said, I'm a philosopher. I'm not talking about origins at all. And in fact, she doesn't talk about origins. She has, if I use Auerbach, mimesis, she has a figurative comparison between three modern phenomena, by collapsing time and place and salvaging similarities and dissimilarities among them. That's why she allows herself to place totalitarianism, anti-Semitism, and imperialism side by side without talking about any causal relationship between them. And Erich Auerbach talks about this kind of figurative analysis and comparison in literature, of course, but I think it's very, very related here. Arendt was a student of Weber, but at the same time she was a student of Carl Schmitt. In the 30s, she participated in a seminar with Carl Schmitt in Berlin before she left Germany with other people from the Frankfurt school. And she talks about bureaucracy, certain bureaucracies as arbitrary. Bureaucracies that are not in accordance with the rule of law. Now, Carl Schmitt, we all know who Carl Schmitt, infamous Carl Schmitt was. Carl Schmitt is a philosopher of legal studies and constitutional affairs. Very brilliant, I must admit. And in his political theology, he asks a very simple question. He says, okay, we know that, for example, if we look at 17th century science, we look at scientists like Newton, Kepler, Boyle. They're all pious scientists. I mean, the scientific revolution wasn't a secular revolution, as we may think. It was a Protestant revolution. And those deist physicists believed in God. I actually was working on Principia Mathematica in my dissertation. And, you know, when you read all the 3 laws of mechanics, we talked about it yesterday, Newton says, well, this is all right. But in the introduction he writes, but we have to remember that God gave the first impulse to the solar system. And Schmidt reads this kind of deist approach to nature, and he says to himself, right, the laws of nature work by themselves, but when God wants, he can stop them and make a miracle. Now the question is, where is the miracle in the political theory? Where is the equivalent? What is, in the theory of sovereignty, is the sovereign obeys to the law, or the law obeys to the sovereign? And he says that in an analogous way, where the laws of nature are being controlled by God, the sovereign has to control the laws of society, the political laws. Therefore, the analogy or the analogous case to the miracle is, of course, a state of emergency. When the state is under attack, when society is under attack, the sovereign who can declare state of emergency or the exception of the law under the auspices of the law. And why is it so? Because politics is about the friend and a foe. It's a binary opposite between friends and foes. This dichotomous model. Like if you wanted to say what aesthetic is, we have to differentiate between beauty and ugliness or whatever. And you want to talk about morality, you have to distinguish between good and evil. Here we have to distinguish when there's no a friend and a foe system, there's no politics. And therefore, the sovereign has to be able to stop the laws of nature or the law of society and declare a state of emergency. And, for example, we see this binary construction in what Schmidt and Benjamin and Spinoza in a different era would define as political theology. That is, politics is analogous to theology. It's not theology, but analogous to theology. And in Schmidt, I won't go into that unless you would want to ask me later on. In Schmidt, there are 2 kinds of political theologies. One is genealogical. That is, all modern concepts in political theory are ancient, religious, secularist concept. What is sovereignty? Is a sovereign, is God. Or what is the invisible hand of the market in Adam Smith? Of course, the hand of God. It's very simple. If you read the Wealth of Nation and the Theory of Moral Sentiment, you see how Adam Smith refers to God. So these are concepts that we look at the genealogy of concept from the religious world, the pre-modern religious world, into the modern language and concepts. So this is genealogical. And then the other one is analogical. Politics, the polity is analogous to theology. Now, if we accept this, and the idea that Schmidt says that the sovereign is who declares states of emergency, in a sense that it changes the balance between, or what Schmidt called decisionism. There's a bigger or stronger way of decisionism as opposed to legislation, parliamentary decision, etc. The government or the sovereign take more and more liberty to decide, and in non-democratic ways and not according to liberal law. Now, this decisionism, for example, is being, for example, in Israel, Israel kidnaps a Lebanese sheikh in order to exchange him with an Israeli pilot that was in curfew in Lebanon. And the Supreme Court says that this is unconstitutional. You have to let him free. And people say, oh, the Supreme Court is too activist. How come he interferes with political issues? And people say, no, we have to declare a state of emergency and say that the state does it despite what the Supreme Court says. So this kind of conflict exists everywhere, and this is what Schmidt refers to. Now, state of emergency, state of exception, you'd find, of course, more and more. You'd find, for example, in America, after the 9/11, you'd find the Patriot Act, which was actually an example of what we call the temporal state of exception, or Guantanamo, which is the special, as in space, state of exception. By the way, the place I come from is hypothetically and potentially a big Guantanamo. Israel operates under state of exception and emergency rules since 1945 and since the British rule of Palestine, and never ceased to exist. And for example, I said it last night to some people, during the last war in Gaza, Israel arrests 1,500 Palestinians under administrative arrest, under the state of emergency, just to be sure that they won't go into the street to demonstrate against the war. Now I get into the point, into the main argument. In the origin of totalitarianism, which we find in the desk in second floor, there is a second book on imperialism. And in the book on imperialism, there is particular one chapter which is called Race and Bureaucracy. And Hannah Arendt describes there a British figure by the name of Lord Cromer. I'm working on a book on Lord Cromer, who was the general counsel in Egypt for 27 years, from 1883 to 1907, I guess, 08. And he was really, he was a flamboyant guy who, his real name was Evelyn Baring, and in Egypt, people used to call him Overbearing. And he became a model for Hannah Arendt to describe a model of imperial or colonial bureaucracy, which is very different than the Weberian model that we are accustomed to. She refers to Lord Cromer at least 34 times in this chapter. She quotes from his writing. He wrote a treaty on bureaucracy. And this treaty of bureaucracy was aimed to manage the subject races, not citizens, not regular people, subject races. And the argument goes that the races are not ripe enough to manage themselves or to participate in political activities, and therefore they have to live under state of emergency, and bureaucracy has to be very different than bureaucracy in the metropole, etc., etc., etc. By the way, Cromer was very instrumental in the history of Zionism. If I won't have time for that, but he was involved once in an idea to populate the Jews in the Sinai Desert in El Arish, and he was very instrumental to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which actually says at the time that the Jewish people, the British says, the Jewish people are entitled to have a national home in Palestine, and they were requested to give free rights to the minorities by the time the minorities were 94% of the population. the Jews were only 6%. So that attests to the decision of the British that the Jews can compose a nation, but the Arabs in Palestine are not ready for that. And this was based on Lord Cromer's analysis in Egypt, where the Egyptians are not ripe enough to become a nation because they are different races or whatever. Anyway, Lord Cromer, Edward Said uses some of his texts from modern Egypt in his book on Orientalism. I mean, it was like, if you want to find a quintessential Orientalist, this is Lord Cromer. He would say, for example, contrast to European talkative mind, bursting with superfluous energy, active in mind, inquisitive about everything he sees and hears. The Eastern is devoid of energy and initiative, stagnant in mind, and all kind of Orientalist argument about the subject races. So now, so far, we have described two models of bureaucracy. One is the Weberian model, which is based on predictability. I mean, this is Pierre, we talked today about what rationality is all about. And I think that the idea of rationality throughout, even though it's changes in character and context, I would say that the idea of predictability is the foundation of what rationality is in the law, in the legal system, in the economic system. And the Weberian model talks about predictability, about efficiency, about transparency, or predictability rather than abruptness, or efficiency rather than chaos, or transparency rather than secrecy. And the second model is a racial bureaucracy which is based on race, and is based on political theology, and is based on abruptness and abrupt decrees. And if you read Cromer and you see how he thinks about bureaucracy, he thinks about secrecy and emergency and abrupt interventions and lack of predictability. He calls it a hybrid bureaucracy. And Hannah Arendt calls it arbitrary bureaucracy rather than a legal bureaucracy. So for example, there were abrupt decrees. By the way, I have a student who wrote about the bureaucracy, the Israeli bureaucracy in the West Bank. I mean, people really don't know what happens there. Who makes decisions, where to go, who is the sovereign. The sovereign is a phantom thing. It disappears and reappears, and it, you never know what kind of form to fill out in order to move around in the region, and they change the forms every day. Nobody knows about it. It's a very different way of thinking about bureaucracy, which is not an accident. For example, a Weberian bureaucracy can behave in such a way, but it's not constituted on such elements. Both are what Weber would call structures of domination, but they are built in a very, very, very different way. The colonial bureaucracy is, first of all, racialized, as I said earlier, and colonial bureaucracy is, Hannah Arendt says in Race and Bureaucracy, that race became a substitute for a nation, and bureaucracy becomes a substitute for government. Now this is all topsy-turvy, upside down, because we are used to think about modernity where the ethnicity is replaced by nationalism, religion is replaced by something more modern, and here we see a kind of reverse in thinking. Yes, the notion of race is a replacement of nation, and the notion of bureaucracy is a substitute for government. Now, in fact, when Hannah Arendt reads the text about Cromer, or the text that Cromer is providing us, she shows us, in many senses, that the exception is not only temporal, but also territorial. There are territories in which the exception is paramount. Colonies, other places in the world, Guantanamo as a metaphor. And here there's a link with Carl Schmitt. I hate to say wonderful because he's not a wonderful man, but brilliant, brilliant book, Nomos of the Earth. I mean, if one reads Nomos of the Earth, you get an idea how this guy is thinking. This guy is anti-colonialist. He thinks that colonialism corrupts Europe. And the relationship between Hannah Arendt and Carl Schmitt are vague, and there are, you know, the literature debates about it. Some people say, oh, she was against Carl Schmitt, and some people say, no, she is actually thinking along the lines that Carl Schmitt supplies, not in a normative way, but in terms of, in a way of analysis. But if you look at the model of bureaucracy that Cromer supplies, which is the Indian model, it starts in India and then moves to Egypt. And I've just finished a paper which shows how this model travels from India to Egypt to other places where British colonialism prevails. And British colonialism is different than, for example, French colonialism, in the sense of that British colonialism is based on direct rule, indirect rule, and very small number of administrative clerks and people on the ground compared to other empires. And she shows that people like Warren Hastings, Lord Curzon, Sir George Grey, Harry Smith in South Africa, people like that use the same model of bureaucracy to manage the subject races, and this model spread around in the colonies. Now, we basically talk about two models: the Weberian liberal bureaucracy, which is supposed to be liberal, universal. The exception exists, but it is temporal. That applies to citizens. That racism exists, but is a deviation from the system. It's not a foundational element of the system. Rationality is based on the link between means and goals, and rationality can become instrumental, of course, Weber says. And later on, for example, Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, developed the concept of means ends chains and how rationality become instrumental rationality. He says, for example, if I want to make a decision, for example, I want to send my son to a Nantes school. This may or may not be a rational decision. This is debatable. But from this moment on, I can make very rational steps. I mean, I can take the car, take it to the garage, prepare it. I mean, all these elements are rational. But the very beginning of the very question, if I send my son to a Nantes school, this is a debatable question. Nobody can determine rationally if this is rational or not. In this case, when evil emerges, it results from malfunctioning. That is hyper-instrumental rationality, that is banality of evil. But if we take the second model, which is a regime of exception and immunitatis, where the exception is permanent, which applies not to citizens but to subject races, where the system is racialized, where theological principle and political theology exist, and rationality is based on circularity and performativity, on secret rules and chains. Evil now is not banal, but radical, what Hannah Arendt called radical evil. And in radical evil, as bureaucracy is not efficient, is not predictable, or not, at least not always predictable. For example, German officers in the East waiting for supplies, and they do not get supplies because the trains take the Jews to concentration camps, and there are no trains to bring supplies to the East. This is non-rational in terms of Weberian bureaucracy, of course. And radical evil is the alternative that is being presented to the banality of evil. And here is my answer to the first question I posed. What model of bureaucracy did Hannah Arendt have in mind when she came to Jerusalem? I don't think that she had a Weberian model when she came to Jerusalem. It was a model based on Cromer's ideal type of bureaucracy. Cromer was a contemporary of Weber, and in a paper that I saw that Kim had in his hand, I showed that sometimes she describes verbatim the same sentences. She describes Cromer and Eichmann, and as if she did cut and paste. So she had in mind a very different idea of bureaucracy than the standard liberal bureaucracy that we are used to think about. And the conclusion from that point on for me is that she establishes a link between imperialism and genocide. That totalitarianism and imperialism are linked, not in a causal way, because she wasn't that kind of a scientist, but in a figurative way. She would say, I mean, if she would be alive, she would say, in response to that talk, she would say, yes, there are repertoires of bureaucracy that exists in both cases. There's no causal relationship, but I would suggest that we should look at the similarities between those bureaucracies to understand how evil and radical evil, together with the banality of evil, exist in those kind of situation. And now I would like to go to the second question. And I think it's a rather startling question. Why did Schmidt dedicate his book, Political Theology, to Weber? If there is such a distinction between a Weberian model and a Cromerian or imperial model of bureaucracy, how come Carl Schmitt devotes or consacre his political theology to Weber? And I think that if we salvage Max Weber, that was translated first time to English by Parsons, Talcott Parsons in America in 1947. And Talcott Parsons, I've written an article about that too, if Talcott Parsons was the first person to import Weber into the English-speaking world, and he did not only translated Max Weber from German to English, but he Americanized Max Weber in many senses. And there are many examples where, for example, the word Herrschaft would become leadership and those kind of things, rather than domination and things like this. I don't have time to get into that. But if we, and this is, for example, an argument made by Mommsen, if we take, for example, the three phases of legitimacy in Max Weber's model: charismatic, traditional, and legal rational. We always used to talk about them as sequential, as chronological, as if they present different periods or eras in history. I kind of examined many textbooks in sociology. They appear in an orderly way, as if one proceeds after the other. But who said that? Weber said that. Weber never says that they appear singularly, separately in different periods. Like once upon a time, legitimacy was because, charismatic leaders. Then there was traditional sources of authority, and then comes the modern world with the legal, rational thing. Weber never says that. In fact, if you read Weber, and a few years ago I spent a whole vacation to read all 4 books of economy and society to see if Weber says such a thing. He never says. He says the opposite. He says that they appear simultaneously. All forms of domination encountered in empirical reality are mixtures of these 3 types, simultaneously. So if we do away with the modernist interpretation that these are stages in the development of society and read Weber more carefully, Weber shows intolerance to a theory of sovereignty of the people, for example, or to democracy. This is the great liberal thinker and the founding father of sociology, which I admire for his sociology, by the way. He's very, very eloquent in his analysis, and we all do Weberian sociology in a sense. But he said that, for example, in a letter to Michels, that parliamentary democracy is a mere ideological trash. This is Weber in 1908. The interpretation of Weber as a non-modernist, non-chronological, comes close to Carl Schmitt's notion of political theology in that interpretation, in that kind of interpretation. And now we've come full circle. So we had 2 models of bureaucracy, which in essence are not that different, in a sense, if we adopt this kind of interpretation about Weber. But now it becomes clearer why the rule and the exception play a dominant role in Weber's epistemology as well. Why all this important? First, as I said in the beginning, I think that it is important because the West and otherwise employ colonial bureaucracies even today in many, many places. For example, I recently read a book on Abu Ghraib, it's the prison in Iraq by Gurevich and Morris. And if you read carefully what they have to say, the bureaucracy that manages the prison in Iraq was completely in accordance with the Cromerian model. People didn't know, there were no rules, everything was a hearsay, everything was exception of the exception of the exception, there were no rules, there were no code of conduct, neither for the prisoners nor for their guards. Clearly the use of a legal liberal model of bureaucracy doesn't fit here. So this is one reason why we use colonial bureaucracy to understand what happens in different places in the world today, particularly in what we called third world. And secondly, because of the internalization of the colonial geopolitical system, and once upon a time the natives were there over the sea. Now they pay back and they live within us. I'm saying that, of course, sarcastically. And in order to understand how bureaucracy works, we have to understand that we don't have fellow citizens, but we have to distinguish and identify a friend from a foe. So I won't forget this case where a policeman shots a young guy from African guy in the tube because he thought he is some kind of a terrorist, and he was acquitted because under the war of terror you make mistake or whatever, those kind of things. I mean, the enemy exists within you. I mean, in Israel today, when there is even a Palestinian who, for example, in a car hit few people in a bus station, some people in the street just shot him, and that was never, they were never put to trial. because every possible enemy, every possible non-Jew is an enemy in potential. In this respect, the big cities in Europe exemplify what we would call the post-colony. Post-colony is within Europe itself, not only overseas. And if we go to Arendt and ask, okay, what do we have here? We have a suggestion where she, according to my interpretation, suggests that we should consider colonial bureaucracies as a phenomena that existed in the past, exists in the present, and there are some links between this imperial past and wrongdoing and evil done by totalitarian regimes. And the question is, why does this interpretation is omitted in the literature? And I think that beyond the obvious answers that, for example, people don't like to compare the Holocaust to other cases of genocide, and that is paramount in the historiographical tradition of the Holocaust. But I think there's something else going on. Hannah Arendt publishes her The Origin of Totalitarianism in 1950. And she publishes Eichmann in Jerusalem in 63, but she was in Jerusalem in 61. And these are the heydays of the Cold War. And I think that during this period, what happened is that during the Cold War, the opposition are not anymore Europe and the colonies, but the West and the East, Eastern Europe. And I think in this opposition, the concept like totalitarianism or primitiveness or things like this moved away back from the colonies into Europe itself. So we think about the Soviet mentality or about Nazism that is a moment of barbarism, a relapse within Europe. But then the very suggestion to look at the colonies is forgotten. And so we have like two phenomena simultaneously. One, that Hannah Arendt, Banality of Evil, is popularized to the extent that today you cannot make an argument about the Holocaust without invoking the banality of evil as the dominant explanation. And at the other time, this very interpretation itself conceals its colonial roots. And I think this double phenomena that exists here needs to be addressed and explained. Hannah Arendt, 5 minutes? 2. Hannah Arendt, for example, I have more to say, but that's the nature of those kind of things. Hannah Arendt herself was at one point a member, and this is an interesting, from political point of view, of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was an organization that was founded in Europe by the CIA to block, in 1950, to block Stalinism. And basically, through the Ford Foundation, the Americans instituted 14 different intellectual journals and scientific journals in Europe in order for the European intellectuals not to glissant into Stalinism. And Hannah Arendt was part of that. She met with Michael Josselson, the head of the thing. In 1955, she was part with Edward Childs and Daniel Bell. They were all part of this organization to talk about ideology. For example, Daniel Bell, The End of Ideology, the very famous sociological book, was written in that spirit. And Hannah Arendt was part of it in Milan in 1956. And this is very, very much similar to The End of History,
of today's. I mean, this is the 1950s version of the end of history, which was actually an argument against communism and Stalinism. So I think this Cold War discourse really diverts this discussion of totalitarianism from where it started into Europe itself, and therefore erases its genealogical and colonial roots. Thank you.